Hey y'all, hi. So over the years, I've gotten a pile of requests to make a video talking about the concept of the fantasy self. This is my attempt at such a video, or maybe my first attempt, we'll see. If you are new to my channel, let me explain. My name is Hannah, and this is mostly a beauty channel. I review makeup, discuss fashion, and some of my videos stay kind of on the surface of that kind of content. But I'm also fascinated by the forces that underpin our desires and our shopping behaviors. So some of my content veers into more philosophical territory. If you like this, and especially if you'd like to see a variety of videos, both shallow and deep, that interrogate the human love of beauty, then I hope you will subscribe. And now let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. So one of the reasons that it's taken me so long to gather my thoughts and gird my loins for this video is that I sometimes find myself troubled by the concept of the fantasy self, the way that it's handled on social media and in the fashion and beauty space. The basic definition of the fantasy self, the cultural consensus about what that phrase means, is that it's the aspirational version of yourself, who you want to be and who you want others to perceive you as being. I've scrolled past a lot of self-help posts on Instagram encouraging me to stop putting pressure on myself to manifest this aspirational version of Hannah and to declutter all of the stuff that I might have collected in an effort to pursue that vision. But the thing is, most of the positive changes in my life have come about because I aspired to be a better version of myself, made a plan, and then took action to manifest that aspiration. Some of these changes have been, you might say, on the shallow end. For example, years ago, I decided that I aspired to be a woman with a beautiful collection of chunky knitwear who mostly wore chunky knits in the winter. So I started collecting dramatic chunky knits, and now I am that woman, and I love being her. You know, it took work, it took time and focus and money, and it also required me to resist the temptation to buy other beautiful garments like coats, winter blouses, and dresses so that I would have enough money to buy the knitwear and enough room in my closet for the knits and enough time and enough days during the winter to get good use out of all of my knits. It was a full-on project, and it was a project grounded in aspiration. I had a fantasy of myself, and I turned it into a reality. The most important changes, though, have come from deeper and more difficult aspirations. So, for example, right now, I'm trying to cultivate a daily meditation practice, like a serious meditation practice. I aspire to be a woman who meditates every morning, and it's really hard. Some days I feel myself chafing at the practice, and the only thing that keeps me going is the vision of my future self, this woman who's worked at it and who's gotten over the hump and who finds sitting down to a daily meditation practice much easier. I'm using this vision, the aspirational version of myself, this vision of who I want to be, to change my life. And the thing is, it's working. 2 months ago, I started with like a 10-minute struggle bus daily meditation practice. Now I'm up to 25 minutes, and it's dramatically changing my inner mechanisms and the way that I interact with people. The aspiration is helping me change my life, and it's bearing fruit. If I believed that it was wrong to ever put pressure on myself to manifest an aspirational version of Hannah, I would have given up on all the goals and challenges that changed my life and made me who I am today, especially the difficult ones. So I'm skeptical when I see advice that basically says, stop dreaming about an aspirational version of yourself who meditates every day and wears editorial knitwear. You can let yourself off the hook. It's okay to admit that you'll never be that person. But the concept of a fantasy version of myself that is totally unrealistic and unaligned with my actual experience and my potential experience, a fantasy self that doesn't guide me forward but kind of haunts and confuses me and keeps me stuck in a loop, that's totally legit. And I have had experiences with that kind of fantasy too. Letting go of that kind of fantasy was an especially important step for me on my journey away from overspending on makeup and clothes, which I talked about at length in my video, How My No-Buy Year Changed My Life, and I'll link that below in case you haven't seen it. So where is the line between a fruitful, self-motivating vision of a person that you want to become and a damaging fantasy of a person you were never meant to be? How can we tell the difference? When I went looking for information to help me put together an answer to this question, I came across what I believe is the blog post that originated the term fantasy self. It's from 2011. It's by Francine J., a minimalist blogger and writer, and it's called Declutter Your Fantasy Self. Of course, I'll link this down below too. But here's the thing. This post isn't about the pressure that your fantasy self puts on you to change yourself. It is not saying stop dreaming about a version of yourself that meditates every day in an editorial sweater. You can let yourself off the hook. You'll never be that person. Francine J's original Fantasy Self blog post is entirely and specifically about the stuff that you might buy or might have bought in an attempt to change yourself without otherwise making a plan or an effort to change yourself. And at the heart of this blog post is a list of fantasy self examples. So the post says, is your fantasy self a culinary diva who has the pots, pans, gadgets, and gizmos to whip up any dish or confection under the sun when your real self would rather order takeout? Is your fantasy self a socialite with a closet full of cocktail dresses with shoes and bags to match when the social event of your week is going to the coffee shop? Is your fantasy self a knitter or a sewer, scrapbooker, woodworker extraordinaire with enough supplies to fill a craft store when you rarely ever complete a project? Is your fantasy self a cello virtuoso with a library of sheet music when you haven't picked up the instrument since high school? Etc., etc. So those are just a few of them. She has a long list. Then she goes on to write, storing our fantasy selves' stuff isn't fair to our real selves. Not only does it make us feel like failures, it takes away the space and time we could devote to uncovering our true passions and potential. And I totally agree with this. If you haven't played the cello since high school and your library of sheet music makes you feel bad every time you look at it, it could be a good move to just let go of the fantasy of yourself as a cellist, declutter the sheet music, and get that yucky feeling and that pressure out of your life. But look at this. We can write equivalent questions, right? Versions of these questions featuring the examples, my personal examples of fantasies that have successfully turned into reality. Is your fantasy self a woman with a daily meditation practice who has a fancy meditation cushion, a statue of the Buddha, a bunch of books about mindfulness, and a meditation app on her phone when you've never managed to meditate for more than 2 days in a row? Is your fantasy self a woman with a closet full of dramatic editorial knitwear when you usually just end up wearing a plain black top? Before I started my recent practice, I had never managed to meditate for more than a couple of days in a row. And a couple of years ago, before I slowly changed my winter wardrobe, I did usually end up wearing just a black top. So what's the difference between the person who is haunted and hamstrung by the fantasy of being a cellist and the woman who's inspired and motivated by the fantasy of meditating every day and having a closet full of editorial knitwear? The difference, I've decided, after much research and much thought, the difference is in how you act on the fantasy. I believe in dreaming about the person you could become, even when it's as shallow as dreaming of a new color that you might add to your wardrobe or how your nails might look if you stopped biting them and grew them out long. Fantasy can lead to reality, but, and this is the absolute heart of the matter, get ready, fantasy cannot lead to reality if you only act on that fantasy by buying stuff. You cannot change yourself by buying stuff, and you cannot change your life by buying stuff. If you want to fulfill your fantasy of yourself, you have to take action beyond shopping. On the simplest level, a simple example. If you would like to be the kind of person who wears red lipstick all the time, it's not enough to just buy a red lipstick. You have to follow through and wear it. Conventional pop social media self-help wisdom is, if you are the kind of person who wears just lip balm all the time, don't buy a red lipstick just because your fantasy self wears red lipstick. But I think fantasy is more nuanced than that and has the potential to be more joyful than that. What I'd say is, if you want to be a person who almost always wears red lipstick, get yourself a red lipstick and start wearing it every day. It might feel weird at first, but if you push through the discomfort of change, which is natural, soon you'll start to feel really confident in that signature lip. And eventually it will become a special part of your personal style, just like you imagined. When we get ourselves into fantasy self trouble, it's when we delude ourselves into thinking that the purchase itself will make the change and that we don't have to do anything else besides buy something. If you're out shopping and you think, I've always wanted to be the kind of person who wears a signature red lip, so maybe if I buy this fancy red lipstick, then I'll start wearing it all the time. If you think that, that's falling into the trap of thinking that you can change your habits just by buying something. You can't. It doesn't work. And this kind of thinking, which doesn't work, is why dreaming about an idealized version of yourself or having an aspirational version of yourself gets such a bad reputation. For it to work, you have to say to yourself, I've always wanted to be the kind of person who has a signature red lip, so I'm going to buy this red lipstick and I'm going to wear it every day for 2 weeks and see how that feels. My equivalent is the sweaters. I know I'm wearing red lipstick today, but I don't wear it every day as a signature. It's just a coincidence. I'm also not wearing a chunky knit, didn't really plan it out, but my equivalent is the sweaters. I didn't just buy the sweaters, I also wear the sweaters. I changed my wardrobe and I changed my habits and my style concurrently. It's the wearing of the sweaters, the wearing of the red lipstick that is the absolutely crucial change-making action. Even if your aspiration of yourself seems to hinge on the acquisition of some specific kind of stuff, it's making use of that stuff that is actually what takes your aspiration from fantasy into reality. When it comes to changing deeper habits, like more complex, more difficult things like cooking more of your meals instead of takeout, learning a musical instrument, it's even more tempting to buy into the false belief that you can change your life by buying something. Because changing those habits is hard, but buying stuff is easy. It would be great if buying new kitchen gadgets was the only kind of labor required for you to start cooking more of your own meals. But cooking requires much more labor and like different kinds of labor, even beyond buying the groceries. Meal planning, scheduling, energy, focus. If you aren't used to cooking your own meals and all the infrastructure that goes along with that, you have to make a plan for how your life will be organized in order to facilitate that, and then you have to follow that plan. This might involve a purchase or two along the way, but those purchases alone won't change your life. All of this might sound super obvious right now, the way that I'm saying it, but inside of our heads, inside of our lives, it can be hard to remember. It can be hard to sort it out because advertising, so much of the advertising of everything from clothes to makeup to workout gear to pots and pans is based on the lie that you can change your life by buying stuff. And after some thought, I've come to see this core lie as the most important concept for understanding the fantasy self and being able to catch ourselves in the act of the kind of fantasy self-related behaviors that haunt and hamstring us instead of inspiring and motivating us. And I think that there are two situations in which we can ask ourselves key questions to reveal whether our underlying motives are coming from the legendary, the notorious fantasy self, or from the kind of fantasy of the self that is aspirational and motivational. Situation one is when you are about to buy something. And these are the questions to ask, I think, when you're about to buy something. Am I buying this because I hope that it will change who I am or change my life? If so, what exactly is the change I'm longing for? What aspirational version of myself do I imagine that this purchase will manifest? And then once you have named the aspiration, then you're cooking with gas, right? Once you have said to yourself, for example, I'm buying this blouse because I imagine myself wearing it at parties and being really mysterious and alluring. Or I'm buying this frying pan because I imagine myself cooking eggs for my breakfast every morning instead of buying a muffin at Starbucks. Once you have done that, once you have zeroed in on it, named it, painted for yourself a very clear picture of the aspiration, then you can ask yourself, what is the corresponding action that will turn that fantasy into a reality? In the case of the blouse, the corresponding action is going to a bunch of parties and being mysterious and alluring. So blouse aside, is that something that you plan to do? Is that on your horizon? Because buying the blouse, just buying the blouse, isn't going to make it happen. In the case of the frying pan, the corresponding actions are buying eggs, making time in the morning to cook the eggs, cooking the eggs, and then eating the eggs before you leave the house? Are those all things that you truly plan to do? Because buying the frying pan isn't going to make those things happen. The answer might be yes. The answer might be yes in both cases. It might be that the purchase is facilitating an action that you truly plan on completing, a change you truly plan on making. You might be buying a tool to turn your fantasy into reality, a tool that you will use as you execute those actions. But if you're not, if you're just buying the things hoping that the purchase alone will make the change, and if the thought of actually following through, once you put your finger on it, is unrealistic or unappealing and not really how you want to spend your energy, or if you can't really see yourself leaping the gap from here to there, then you know that the fantasy self has reared her ugly head. So this is how we can keep ourselves from making purchases that revolve around fantasies that are, for the time being, destined to stay fantasies. If you don't have the life circumstances or the energy or the desire, like the fully integrated desire to take the actions that will turn your fantasy into reality, then don't buy the stuff that belongs to that fantasy. Situation 2 for these questions is when you're deciding whether to keep something, when you're decluttering. And the questions are essentially the same. Am I keeping this thing because I hope that it will change me or change my life? If so, what exactly is the change I'm longing for? What exactly do I imagine that keeping this thing around will eventually cause to manifest in my life? Once you have named the aspiration, I'm keeping this red lipstick because I've always wanted to be someone who wears red lipstick, or I'm keeping this guitar because I've always wanted to learn how to play the guitar. Once you've named it, then you can move on to asking yourself about the requisite action. What is the necessary action that will be required for me to turn this fantasy into a reality? For the lipstick, the necessary action is to start wearing it every day. For the guitar, the necessary action is to sign up for lessons or to set aside time to practice every day. In this situation, the declutter, it's interesting. You already have the tool, you already have the stuff. And the question is just, do I have the time, energy, desire, and grit to use these tools to make that desired change in my life? And if the answer is no, that's okay. I mean, if the answer is no, that's actually really exciting. It means that you've realized, that you've articulated to yourself that you care more about other things than you do about this fantasy that has maybe been burdening you. It's a huge relief to just say to yourself, I'm going to let this fantasy stay a fantasy. I could make it a reality, but I don't actually want to right now because I don't want to do the actions that are necessary for making it a reality. And in that case, I agree wholeheartedly with the original blog post. It can be wonderfully freeing to declutter the stuff that has been associated with that fantasy. So that's where my recent ruminations on the fantasy self have brought me. I think that the fantasy self lurks in those moments when we're about to make a purchase. I think that she also lurks in some of the stuff that we keep in our homes. She is characterized by the false belief that stuff itself can change your life. There's nothing wrong with dreaming about making changes in your life, but if you catch yourself believing that making a purchase is the same as making a change, or believing that some of the stuff sitting around your house is going to make you change, then you can say, aha, I'm in the clutches of the old school fantasy self, and act accordingly. I hope that for those of you who have been asking, that this video was at least part of what it was cracked up to be. I appreciate you so much for your curiosity and persistence. And I don't know, I feel like there's probably more to say on the topic. So if you'd like to see a part 2, a follow-up to this, let me know. Thank you so much for being here, for subscribing, for commenting and liking my videos. And I really, really hope that you are remembering to take extra good care of yourself so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.